So if you're looking to become a liquidity provider for THORChain, the number one thing you're probably wondering is, what are my rewards going to look like over time? So this video is going to walk you through how to use the THORYield LP Calculator so you can change all kinds of parameters and see exactly what your LP position would look like over different time periods. So on THORSwap itself, under the dashboard view and liquidity pools, I can see all the different pools available, and I can see the listed APYs right here. But if I go over to THORYield, I'll be able to calculate this in a lot more detail. So let me show you that. On THORYield, we're going to go to Explorer and LP Calculator. And so this calculator is going to allow me to put in all different parameters and see exactly what would happen over time. And through doing some examples here, I'll also explain impermanent loss and THORChain's impermanent loss protection. So any liquidity pool on THORChain is always 50% some asset and 50% Rune. No matter what, you're always going to have that half exposure to Rune. So what this calculator does is allows you to put in exactly what you'd be adding of this asset and Rune, and then predict prices over time, what the APY is going to be over time, how long you're going to be in the pool, what exactly you deposited, and then see what that would have worked out to if your predictions end up playing out. So let's just run through some examples and you'll see how this works. First, you just select which asset you want to be pooling. So let's say we want to pool some Bitcoin and Rune because we want to have exposure to both Bitcoin and Rune. So it's automatically pulling some stats live, the Bitcoin price, the Rune price, and the current APY of that pool on THORChain. Here we have price predictions for both assets. So do we think Bitcoin is going to go up or down over this time period? Same for the Rune side. So for example, we could say, I think I'll stay in for 12 months, and let's see what happens if Bitcoin went up by 25%, but Rune went up by 75%. Then you have to set how much of the assets you're actually adding to the pool. So let's say we're adding 1 Bitcoin and the equivalent of 1 Bitcoin in Rune, which is right about 10,000 Rune right now. So you'll notice that the deposit method right now is set to Bitcoin and Rune. That means I'm adding equal parts of both assets. You do have the option to add just one of the two assets, but it's all the same on the back end. It's being split for you. So for example, if I wanted to add only Bitcoin, this would be the same as adding 2 Bitcoin asymmetrically. It would be the same as adding 1 Bitcoin and the equivalent amount of Rune. Same thing would go for adding just Rune. I could add 20,000 or so. But just be aware that these are all the same on the back end. It's just a convenient step of how you want to add. But how the numbers end up playing out, including impermanent loss protection, which I'll touch on in a bit, all ends up being exactly the same. So once we've put in what we want to deposit, some price predictions, we could have changed the APY if we wanted to be conservative and over what time period we want to see what this works out to. Then we get the results down here. So initial investment, this is of course in dollar terms what you started with. Predicted value, this is how much the position would be worth after that much time if all of your predictions are correct, this APY and these prices, then that's how much it would be worth after that time period. And of course, that is the difference, that is the gain. Performance versus HODL, this is really the most important metric because this is showing you how well you did versus if you had just held these assets from the very beginning. So while this is of course factoring in the increase in price that we did for this example, this is only how much better you are off from liquidity providing versus if you had just been holding. So this is truly the rewards from being in the pool. And then this just shows the breakdown of what you would actually be left with in terms of BTC and Rune. In this example, you're ending up with more BTC and actually less Rune because we had Rune going up much more than BTC. So you have rebalancing that is occurring. The pool is always balancing back to 50-50 and your position is always 50-50. And because of this rebalancing, you can end up with impermanent loss, which is a complex thing. You could look up different videos for a more in-depth explanation. But in simple terms, it is a loss that occurs due to the rebalancing back to 50-50, where in some cases, you could end up worse off than if you had just held. And that's where the impermanent loss protection will kick in that I'll get into in a second. So just to change this example a bit so it's a little clearer, let's say that the price just stayed flat for the entire 12 months. Now, this would be as expected. My performance versus HODL is exactly equal to the APY of the pool, which makes sense. I'm not losing anything to rebalancing because I have my prices of the two assets staying exactly flat. You'll notice that performance versus HODL APY will start to go down if the assets perform differently than each other. So for example, if we have Rune going up 100% and Bitcoin staying flat, then now our real performance versus HODL is 3.67% APY, which is lower than the actual rewards APY, but that's due to the impermanent loss, which is being outweighed by the rewards of the pool. And those rewards of the pool, the APY that you see displayed on THORSwap, this is not anything that's fixed. This relies on two main things, one being the activity of the pool, so how many users are actually swapping and generating fees that go to the liquidity providers. And there are also block rewards coming from THORChain, which are paid out in Rune. So that can vary as the Rune price fluctuates. So these APYs can change depending on activity and market conditions. So now let's tweak this example such that it ends up in a place where you actually lost versus holding, so that you'll see when the impermanent loss protection would kick in. So first thing on that, impermanent loss protection kicks in 1% per day until you have 100% protection after being in the pool for 100 days. So let's set this duration to be just about 100 days. This is in terms of months, so I'm just going to put 3.4 so we can see roughly what that looks like. And actually this example with Rune price doubling and Bitcoin staying flat in only 100 days works out to a negative performance versus HODL because the rebalancing is causing impermanent loss, which means this is how much worse off you would be than if you had just held those initial assets in their initial split the whole time. You'll see that you're losing quite a bit of Rune and you're gaining quite a bit of Bitcoin because we have the prices so diverging in this example. But this is exactly where impermanent loss protection would kick in. Basically, at 100 days, this negative amount would be the amount that you are covered because this is your impermanent loss. So if you ended up in the situation where your performance versus HODL is negative at 100 days, you're worse off than if you had just held these assets even after the rewards, then this amount is what would be covered by impermanent loss protection. And let's say things were really crazy and this happened in only 1 month and then you wanted to withdraw. That means you're now more negative because this happened in a shorter time period, so you had less fees accruing. And this is of course an extreme example, but at only 1 month, you only would have 30 days of impermanent loss protection, so that'd be 30% protection, which would mean you'd be covered for 30% of this negative amount. And any impermanent loss owed will be paid when you withdraw from the pool, technically paid in Rune, but rebalanced into your 50-50 position when you're withdrawing. So going back to 100 days or so roughly, another thing to note, so if you did withdraw at 100 days, this position, you would be no worse off than if you had just held your 10,100 Rune and your 1 Bitcoin, but the actual split of the assets that you get are still going to be 50-50 in value, but altogether the actual value would be equal to if you had just held the two assets. So that is your impermanent loss protection. Keep in mind, that was an extreme example just to show you when impermanent loss protection would kick in. In almost every case, it usually doesn't need to kick in because the APY is so profitable that it outweighs any of the losses from impermanent loss most of the time. But this is what would happen if you are in that situation, so it's good to know how that applies. Let's just do some more realistic examples just to give you a better picture of how this ends up looking. Let's do some ETH and Rune. So let's say we want to deposit, let's just do 1 ETH and the equivalent Rune. Let's go back to a full 12 months and we'll leave the pool APY as it actually is right now. And let's start back at no price movement. So this is how much we would make over that year. Let's say we think ETH is going to go up by 50% and Rune is going to outpace that, going up by 75%. Then we're still up a lot. You'll notice that this is a little bit lower than that, which is from some of that impermanent loss. It's just being far outweighed by all of the rewards. Now, let's say things went the other way. Let's say ETH went down 25% over the year and Rune went down 50% over those 12 months. So in this case, of course, your predicted value, this is just including the volatility of the assets. Of course, this is down because the assets that you're in the pools are going down. But your performance versus HODL is still positive. And this is because you're earning more in terms of the assets that you put in. So it's important to think in terms of dollar amounts, but also the asset amounts, because that's really what you're looking at liquidity pool rewards for, is to earn more of the assets. And permanent loss protection absolutely does not insulate you from the dollar price volatility of the pools, but it does protect you against if you would have been better off just holding onto your assets and never liquidity pooling at all. Now let's go over the different ways of adding. Let's move this back to something a little more positive. Let's say ETH goes up 100% and Rune goes to $10. So again, just to go over, in this case, we're gaining ETH and losing Rune because Rune is going up a lot more than ETH and the pool is being rebalanced. And we're of course way up in our predicted value because this is including the price appreciation of the assets, and our performance versus HODL is doing really well. So we're up that much versus if we had just been holding. So now take note of this number for just a second, and let's change this to as if we had only added ETH. So that would have been 2 ETH, and you'll see that the overall position ends up playing out exactly the same because on the back end, you're still exposed to 50% Rune the whole time, though it's of course showing 0 Rune and only ETH because you're going to deposit just ETH and withdraw just ETH, but everything is actually the same on the back end. This is being calculated a little bit differently from this view because this is saying your performance versus holding just ETH as opposed to your performance versus holding the 50-50 split of ETH and Rune. And just to show the other side, if we switch this to just Rune, now those 2 ETH are equal to having added just 1364 Rune, but you'll see the predicted value ends up playing out exactly the same. This again is showing negative because it's showing it in only Rune terms, meaning you would have been better off holding 100% Rune, but that's really quite different than being in a 50-50 liquidity pool. So just always think of these as 50-50 no matter what. Also keep in mind that impermanent loss protection kicks in from your 50-50 start point, even if you only added from one side. So make sure you're looking at the performance versus HODL for symmetrical. That would be the ILP that you're owed regardless of which way you entered. And when you do have these positions, you can track them on THORYield and you can toggle between the different views. So for example, if you deposited this way, you would still be able to view it as if you deposited both. And we do have a separate video already on tracking your live LP positions, but this is a great tool to be able to project what you think is going to happen and see different scenarios and understand how the pool dynamics affect how your position ends up playing out over time. So hopefully that helps you understand how to use this tool. Definitely would suggest playing around with this before you enter any liquidity pool positions. And when you understand what you're getting into and you want to add to liquidity pools, you can do that on THORSwap. And we do have separate videos showing you step by step how to do that.